Wealthy people who married someone poorer, what surprised you about their past lifestyle? Story 1. I came from a relatively wealthy family, new money. My dad started his own business and grew up poor, so he instilled in me a different kind of financial awareness. My wife, on the other hand, came from a lower-income blue-collar family. We got married right out of college, and neither of us made much money in the beginning. What surprised me most was her approach to spending money. For her birthday, my mom bought her a pair of jeans that had cost over $100. She was shocked and couldn't wrap her mind around spending that much on jeans. But then she wanted to buy me a motorcycle, despite knowing I don't ride. Next, she wanted new furniture, a new bed, and then a new car. Savings and retirement weren't on her radar. We were both too proud to accept money from my parents, but it took her a long time to come around to the idea of having an emergency savings account and focusing on paying off debt. She eventually realized her parents' financial situation wouldn't be so dire if their spending habits were better. Still, old habits die hard. When we recently paid off my car, her immediate thought was that I should get a new one. Story 2. I grew up in a family where money was never an issue. We never had a budget, and I never gave a second thought to the price of groceries, or anything else, really. My husband, on the other hand, had a very different upbringing. He was one of 6 kids with a mom on disability, and they had to live on a strict budget. One day, we were at the grocery store together. He always insists on walking up and down every aisle, meticulously inspecting everything. I was getting frustrated because it was taking so long, and I finally lost it. "Why do you do this?" I asked, exasperated. He paused, then looked at me with a mixture of patience and sadness. "Growing up, we could only spend $100 a week on groceries for all of us," he said quietly. "I always had to put back what I wanted because we couldn't afford it. Now, I can afford whatever I want, so I like to look at everything I could have." It took him 10 years to tell me this. In that moment, I felt like a terrible person for not understanding sooner. The grocery store, a mundane place for most people, was a symbol of scarcity and longing for him. I realized then how much I had taken for granted and how different our experiences had been. Story 3. One of my exes had a knack for making money, easily 2 or 3 times what I could. But he was incredibly bad at saving it. He set himself up as a company to avoid paying higher taxes, but then paid a large amount each month to an accounting company to handle his taxes, which he would end up doing himself because he didn't trust them to get it right. He'd spend money on taxis across the city or hire cars instead of using public transport, book new flights whenever his were canceled without bothering to claim back on insurance, and buy a sports car only to wreck it and sell it for scrap. He worked contracts and then took time off to work on his own startup, but he'd spend every weekend partying, buying drugs and booze. At first, it seemed fun and wild. I thought, wow, money really means nothing to you. But as we became a long-term couple, it started to wear on me. I felt like his mother, constantly nagging him to fill out the insurance paperwork and make smarter financial decisions. The novelty wore off, and the reality of his reckless spending became a constant source of stress. Story 4. Coming from a poorer family, I always felt the stark contrast between my upbringing and my in-laws' wealth. They have a ridiculous amount of money, so by comparison I felt very poor. But my wife, who comes from this affluent background, was the one who faced the real shock. We have 2 young kids, and one day I suggested we look for clothes and toys at local flea markets and garage sales. The idea was completely foreign to her. She had never considered that we could save money by buying gently used items. She had never even been to a garage sale in her life. At first, she was hesitant, but eventually, she came to love it. Now, she questions whether it's worth buying anything new before running to Amazon or a store. Her parents, however, think it's disgusting that we make our kids wear clothes that another child had before. But they don't pay our bills, and they don't understand the satisfaction of finding a great deal on something that still has plenty of life left in it. Story 5. My story doesn't directly relate to the amount of money they had, but it does involve a shocking level of filth. My ex used to live with his mom sometimes, rotating between her and his father. Both places were a disaster. There was dog crap everywhere, dishes piled up, grimy floors, and a pervasive stench of dog pee and cigarette smoke. One time, I had to use the bathroom at one of his parents' places and had to spread my feet while sitting on the toilet to avoid stepping in period blood. It was beyond disgusting. When my ex and I first got married and moved in together, he was baffled that our home was generally clean. Not perfect, but far from the squalor he was used to. Every day he came home, surprised at the difference. On the flip side, I once dated a guy whose stepfather was a lawyer, and they lived a lavish lifestyle. The only thing that surprised him about my lifestyle was that I didn't eat pizza with a knife, fork, and a glass of wine. No matter how much money you have, eating pizza with a knife and fork seems odd unless you have a really good reason. Maybe there's a reason I'm forgetting, but seriously, pizza with a knife and fork? Come on. Story 6. For me, it's the other way around. My fiance comes from a six-figure family. They have a beautiful home in the country, on a well-to-do road, 3 new cars, and they used to go on regular vacations. Meanwhile, my single mom raised my sister and me in a crappy apartment, and we survived on hand-me-downs and government assistance. We weren't dirt poor, but I never bought anything new until I graduated college and moved out on my own. Throughout my relationship with my fiance, we had a series of eye-opening conversations. She realized her family's flashy lifestyle wasn't typical, and I got a glimpse of how the other half lives. She was surprised to learn I had never been camping in an RV or cabin, only in tents. We only went out to eat on very special occasions, whereas her family dined out every weekend at nice restaurants, which shocked me. For most gift-giving holidays, we got practical items, while she received nice electronics. Our different backgrounds led to many of these little realizations. Despite these differences, our financial backgrounds don't really affect us much now. Her family is toxic and has disowned her, long story. And while I love my family, they live far enough away that I don't see them often. We make jokes about her marrying down because of my background, but it's all in good fun. Since many people have asked, here's a TLDR, about my fiance's disownment. My fiance is very different from her family. She's heavier set, which her mom, who has struggled with an eating disorder and hates overweight people, despises. Worse for her family, my fiance is bisexual. And to top it off, I am a trans man. Her mom lost it when we started dating. She didn't want her daughter to date me, not because my family is poor, but because she thought I'd tarnish her sterling reputation and didn't want her to be one of those girls. The disowning was the final straw after 3 years of escalating incidents. One summer, my fiance was home from college working at a grocery store. One morning, her stepfather woke her up 2 hours before her shift, screaming at her, calling her lazy, fat, and other disgusting slurs. He followed her around the house, demanding she get ready in 5 minutes so he could take her to work or she'd have to walk. Mind you, they all had cars, and her job was at least 10 miles away. This escalated to him screaming at her to get her stuff and leave. She called me, begging for help. I couldn't drive, so my mom brought me. When we arrived, my fiance was in her work uniform, standing in the driveway with a bundle of clothes, sobbing. Her stepfather had his hand raised, but dropped it when we pulled in. I had to physically restrain my mom to keep her in the car, knowing there'd be a brawl otherwise. Her mom stood on the porch, doing nothing while all this happened. There's more to the story, but it's exhausting to recount. Even now, 3 years later, her mom still tries to gaslight her, saying she's lying about that day. But I know what I saw, and I reassure her she's not making it up. She doesn't talk about it, but she still has nightmares. They're awful people, and she's better off without them. Money can't buy a family that loves you. This was a lot to unload, and I hope my fiance is doing well now. It wasn't just about the money, it was bad parenting. No matter the financial situation, some parents just suck. Story 7. I'm about to marry him. We met in college, where my parents paid for everything while he had student loans and a part-time job to cover his expenses. If he was really hurting, his parents might transfer $40 into his account, but that was rare, and they gave him hell if he asked. He was always very anxious about spending money and never bought name brands. Essentials like toilet paper were bought 2 rolls at a time, 1 ply only. He didn't realize that buying so little every few days was wasting money rather than buying in bulk. When we booked our first vacation, a cheap road trip to Georgia, he couldn't pay for anything and worried the whole time. The anxiety kept him up at night, and it made me so sad. Even now, he never fills his gas tank all the way, only $10 at a time, which drives me nuts. But now, we both have great full-time jobs, and he rarely has any anxiety about money. He never has to worry anymore, and he is so much happier as a result. I always think about stuff like this when people say money can't buy happiness. Although I don't actually know anyone who says that seriously anymore because it just quite simply can. Sure, past a certain point it becomes superfluous, and that's probably where the saying originated. But when your basic needs aren't being met, yeah, a little money probably helps keep you happier if I had to guess. Story 8. I'm from a middle-class family, but my wife's parents are near billionaires, the 0.001%. Her shock at many aspects of my life was quite profound. For one, she was amazed that I even considered the cost of food and groceries. Her family would go to gourmet food stores, spend over $1,000 without a second thought, and justify it by saying, well, it's for food. We're ingesting this stuff, so it should be the best. Booking non-first-class airfare for any long trip would be considered cruel and unusual punishment to her. She had no concerns about utilities or insurance premiums and didn't understand the concept of comparison shopping for routine things. Every vacation was the finest you could imagine, often bordering on the ridiculous with so many upsells on packages and bespoke items that it felt wasteful. Her understanding of debt and how normal people live was almost non-existent. She was shocked when I would save things that got wet or muddy. She would rather throw clothes and fine items in the trash, even if they were just lightly bruised. Despite these differences, we are very much in love and have learned a lot from each other. She now enjoys hanging out with my salt-of-the-earth mom more than with her own family, and I appreciate being spoiled every now and then. It's a great mix of lifestyles, and we found a balance that works for both of us. Story 9. I didn't marry her, but when we started dating, she always wanted to hang out at my place. She never invited me to hers, which was fine, but I noticed something else too. She started gaining weight, about 35 pounds in just a few months of dating. She was 100 pounds when we started dating, and while her weight gain wasn't an issue for me, I'm a chubby guy myself, I was just glad she wasn't pregnant. Eventually, I found out the reason. Her family couldn't always afford dinner, so when she started dating me, she suddenly had a place to eat every night, and she would gorge herself. It broke my heart to realize how much she had been struggling, and I was glad I could provide some comfort and stability in her life, even if it was just a meal. Story 10. Back when my wife and I were dating, she earned many times more than I did. I was a high school teacher, and she sometimes drove my 10-year-old primer black stick-shift Honda Civic that my cousin lent me until I could afford another car. She was blown away by how aggressively mean people could be when you drove an old, ugly car. One day, after parking, she stepped out of the car and noticed an immediate change in how people treated her. The spell lifted as soon as they saw her, not me, behind the wheel. She gained a lot of respect for me after that, thinking I was a saint for not becoming bitter over the constant mistreatment. Driving that old Honda was a daily challenge. I was constantly getting pulled over by cops, only to be let go, targeted by road rage, and pedestrians felt too comfortable engaging with me in unpleasant ways. It was as if the car made me a magnet for negativity. Now, I drive a newer Honda, just 1 year old, and the difference is remarkable. I drive the same way, perhaps a bit more aggressively, now that I don't have to hear the wind roaring by when I exceed 40 mph, but I haven't been pulled over or had a negative interaction on the road in a long time. My wife now even enjoys trading cars with me, finding it a more pleasant experience altogether. Reflecting on this, it's fascinating how much a car can influence people's perceptions and behavior towards you. My wife's experience with my old car opened her eyes to a reality she had never known, and it brought us closer as she saw the world through my lens, even if just for a little while. Story 11. This is a story my mom relayed to me. I wouldn't quite say that my dad is rich, he's a doctor, but compared to the family she grew up with, he is very wealthy. As a kid, my mom's idea of extravagance was buying gum at the movie theater. She had to pay her father back for this, and he counted every penny. When she started dating my dad, he would take her to the convenience store for a Coke. You know those styrofoam cups of soda you fill up from the fountain? After they married, they continued to do this every week. She was shocked because, to her, the idea of getting a soda was a rare treat, but for Dad, it was nothing, not even pocket change. To this day, 30 years later, Mom gets me a soda every week. Sometimes it's hard to see their love for each other, but these little rituals tell the story of their relationship. It's a super sweet one to end on, I think. And that's not a pun with the soda. I'm so sorry. I wouldn't dare end with a pun. Story 12. My partner and I are both poor, but in different ways. She's never been homeless or had to worry about where her next meal was coming from, while I've faced both of those challenges. Her frugality is extreme. She hates buying anything we don't absolutely need. I, on the other hand, have this desperate need to stock up if we have any extra money. It's a struggle for me not to fill our house with canned or dried goods, just in case we don't have enough money for food next month. It doesn't make sense to her, but for me, it's an instinct born from my upbringing. Growing up, there was never enough food around, and the fear of scarcity has stayed with me. Story 13. I grew up in a poor family where credit cards were considered evil. My parents drilled it into me to never get one because they were never taught how to use them properly either. When I finally had to establish credit and got my first card, I didn't overthink it. I followed the rules and paid it off every month. Then, more and more credit became available to me, and I accumulated more and more cards. An emotionally abusive ex would use my cards for everyday living, promising to pay them off with me. Soon, the interest started to snowball, and before I knew it, I couldn't get out from under the debt. After 4 years of living together, he ghosted me. I was on my own for about a year, coming home from work every day and just sobbing. I was depressed as hell. I met my current boyfriend amidst all this chaos. I noticed he always used credit cards and talked about perks and points. He seemed so responsible with them. It took me a while to open up to him about my debt because I was so embarrassed. The weight on my chest felt like it was there 24/7. The late calls, only paying the minimum on each card every month, barely touching the interest. When I finally opened up to him, he sat down with me and said, "We're a team. We'll figure this out together." He helped me go over all my interest rates and cards to see what the best option was. He even offered to pay it all off with his work bonus that year and let me pay him back, but we hadn't been together that long, and I didn't love him for his money. I didn't even feel comfortable with him paying for dinner often. I knew I had to get out of it myself. One day, he gave me an envelope and told me not to open it until I got home. Inside was $1,000. I didn't want to accept it and felt horrible doing so. He told me he hoped it would help ease the burden and that I could use it however I wanted, even to treat myself to something, since I hadn't been able to do that for so long. I asked if he minded if I used it to pay a lawyer to file for bankruptcy. He said he would support me. I did end up filing for bankruptcy. It was scary, but it was the best decision I've ever made. It felt like 1,000 pounds were lifted off my chest. My boyfriend's understanding and support were invaluable. He didn't push me to accept his help, but respected my need for financial independence, which was huge for me. It's incredible how empathetic and understanding he was, recognizing the importance of financial independence for someone from a lower-class background. His support helped me regain control over my life, and for that, I'm incredibly grateful. Story 14. Growing up, credit cards were a part of life for me. My family encouraged me to get a credit card in my name and use it as much as possible to build credit. There was always money to pay it off each month, so it made sense to collect rewards and airline miles. It was a normal, even encouraged practice. When my partner and I got together, I noticed she always used cash or a debit card. She had a credit card, but only for emergencies. Otherwise, she avoided it like the plague. It took a long time for her to get over her aversion and skepticism about using credit cards. We were fortunate to have 2 good-paying jobs, and over time, she started to see the benefits of building credit and the security it provided. This experience taught me a healthy appreciation for what it means to have a financial cushion and how different our approaches to money had been. Story 15. My family is far from rich, but I grew up closer to the upper middle-class realm and was making 3 times as much as my now husband when we met. He grew up extremely poor, and his family is still living that way. One big difference that surprises him is how my parents will pick up the check when we go out to celebrate a birthday or graduation. They even ask him to choose whichever restaurant he wants. Outside of the ritziest steakhouse in town, they don't care. To his family, a big meal out is going to McDonald's and not eating off the dollar menu. I'm serious. It's been a significant adjustment for him, but he's gradually getting used to the idea that we can occasionally indulge in a nice meal out without it being a big deal. Despite these differences, we found a way to navigate and appreciate each other's backgrounds. Story 16. I grew up with a single mom who couldn't manage money at all. Bills were always behind, and she spent money on everything. In her 50s, she met and married a multimillionaire. We live in Middle America, so his wealth goes further than in many other areas. They gave themselves a budget of $10,000 a month to live on, living off the interest, and they own their home outright. After my mom met him and they got all her finances sorted out and paid off, something changed. She won't spend a penny. He spends money like it's going out of style, and he's even begged me to take her shopping for clothes and accessories, but she refuses. She used to spend more when she was a single mom with nothing. Now, she won't buy a new outfit or even keep groceries in the house unless he buys them. My mom is a retired nurse who gets a retirement and Social Security, but she lives poorer now than any other time in her life. It's baffling to me. The only explanation I can think of is that she's trying to overcompensate to avoid looking like a gold digger. It's a strange situation, and I've rarely heard of people getting their finances in order after coming into money. Usually, having more money just exacerbates poor financial habits. Story 17. I'm not rich at all, but my husband came from a very poor Mexican village. His childhood stories are humbling. He used to shower outside because there was no indoor plumbing, and he used leaves as toilet paper. There's poor, and then there's my husband's previous life poor. He's been living in the US for 12 years now, but when we first met, it was fascinating to see life through his eyes. Going to the cinema was a huge event for him. Heating up food in a microwave was a completely foreign concept. Staying at fancy hotels when we went on vacation felt like a dream to him. Even now, I still see him surprised by things occasionally, and it reminds me of how much I take for granted. My middle-class status, something I never thought much about, is a luxury to him. It's true at any level of wealth, I think. We take for granted what we grow up with, considering certain luxuries as basic needs. Our perceptions are warped by our experiences. What one person sees as a necessity, another sees as a luxury. As we grow up with more money, our definition of basic needs expands. It's a perspective I'm continually learning to appreciate thanks to him.